I wanted to ask you about the significance of this because we've already had announcements from the Russia side of writing off several African countries' debt to Russia. I think a total of 20 billion spread across Angola, Ethiopia, and a few other countries. And then you've also had Putin announce, and you've talked a lot about this, the international north-south trade corridor becoming a potential replacement for the Suez Canal and trade, especially in this region. And this comes after the Black Sea grain deal, which, as you know, the Western media has made a whole lot of noise about, with Russia, of course, pulling out of that deal, citing unfairness, and, of course, the fact that a lot of this grain that they're purporting comes to Africa and poorer countries actually does not. So, talk about the significance of the Russia-Africa summit. I know you just finished a column. You can surely go over the details of that, but I'll turn the mic to you.
Thanks, Danny. Well, this is one of those real game-changing moments in the geopolitical chessboard. I was in Moscow during the preparation of this summit. That was in April, where foreign ministers were there and huge delegations from all over Africa. They were preparing basically this summit this week. And what happened this week is the scope and the breadth of the discussions is absolutely outstanding. They had panels on literally anything you can imagine, including two very important ones on decolonization, which was something that Putin, in his intervention yesterday and also the one today, was very keen to stress. And obviously, the major leaders, heads of state, foreign ministers that are in St. Petersburg, of course, for them, this was a mix of being welcomed by Russia and by BRICS, considering that Russia is arguably with China the top two. In fact, they are the top two BRICS members who who, let's say, conduct the major negotiations intra-BRICS, and bringing, of course, Africa to as some of the next BRICS members of BRICS Plus, which is going to be announced next month at the summit in South Africa and beyond, of course. But Putin went one step ahead. Today, he asked for Africa to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council in front of all of them. Obviously, this is something they have been discussing for years, in fact. And he said that Russia is 1,000,000% behind introducing Africa as a permanent G20 member starting from September at the summit in New Delhi. So this is basically Russia telling the whole of Africa, okay, there are 49 delegations in St. Petersburg out of 54 nations. The ones that are not there is because the American French pressure was absolutely unbearable. And the American and French and EU pressure on all of UK pressure on all of them who are actually there in St. Petersburg, many of them spell it out on the record and off the record. And still they went, and still they knew that considering the preparations 3 months ago in Moscow, they knew that this would be big. And of course, Russian diplomacy, which is peerless, had already talked to virtually all of the participants saying, look, we're going to make big announcements, including, of course, as you mentioned, Russia totally erasing $23 billion of debt across Africa. This means now zero. Can you imagine the empire doing something like that? Never. And of course, yesterday, Putin announcing that there's going to be free grain for 5 or 6 African nations, and the other ones who can afford to pay, contracts will be on a commercial basis with excellent prices. So everybody will have access to free grain from Russia, mostly because Russia this year had their best grain harvest ever, 2023. So all these stupid discussions by U.S. think tank Land and West mainstream media and collective West mainstream media about the blockade to say grain, Africa is going to die of hunger, this is absolute bullshit. You just need to pay attention to, I'm not sure this is being widely reported in the US. I haven't had time to check yet, but I doubt it. Here in Europe, practically zero. The only spin that you hear from US mainstream media and French mainstream media, especially, is that, oh, a lot of head of states decided not to go to St. Petersburg, so Putin is weakened. So this is the level, it doesn't even reach primary school. Expected, of course. But in terms of the just following what was discussed between yesterday and today, the level of discussion, the scope of the panels, about everything you can imagine, as I told you before, and even going beyond that, stuff that many of us could not even foresee before. Basically, there is a Russian offensive to get free trade deals between a lot of African Union members and the Eurasia Economic Union, just like the free trade deals that they have with Vietnam or Cuba, for instance. They want to expand these Eurasia Economic Union free trade deals with a lot of Africans, like dozens of African nations. And sooner or later, and this is the big thing, a very, very close cooperation between the leadership of the Eurasia Economic Union and the African Union. So we can see, I would say, medium to long term, a merger of interests and trade deals and close collaboration, not only in trade and agriculture, but in infotech and technology as well, between the Eurasia Economic Union, which, of course, Russia is the most important partner, but there's also Kazakhstan, which has many things that interest African nations. And I would say at least the top 10 African nations will be very much interested in doing more business, more trade, and more technological interaction with the Eurasia Economic Union. Egypt, Senegal, Nigeria, Morocco, South Africa, which is part of BRICS. Many of these Africans will also become members of BRICS Plus in the short, medium, and long term. So maybe, let's say, projecting 3, 4, 5 years from now, we can have maybe 4 or 5 of the top African economies as part of BRICS Plus. And of course, they are all African Union. And of course, doing more business with the Eurasia Economic Union, which means opening up to more business with China, Belt and Road Initiative. Because one of the things that were discussed today, very, very important. The Russians the macro strategy by the Russians is to interlink closer and closer the Eurasia Economic Union, of course, African Union and BRICS Plus, countries that are outside of all of these, like North Korea, we're going to talk about that in a second, and African Union, and Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese. This is part of the interaction between the Eurasia Economic Union and the Belt and Road Initiative, which is something that when we're going to have the BRI summit in Beijing, probably by October this year, this is going to be even more graphic. So what we saw these 2 days is acceleration of this interconnection, and now it's a Afro-Eurasia connection in full, which was not, let's say, until 2 days ago. And everything that the African nations individually had been doing in terms of trading with China. China invests heavily in at least 35 to 40 African nations. The Russians, now they have a diplomatic drive, a geopolitical drive, and also an economic drive across Africa, especially those, let's say, the Central African belt from Senegal to Eritrea and everything in between, across the Sahel as well, which brings us to something that happened while everybody was in Petersburg discussing Russia-Africa, the coup in Niger, which is, in terms of advancing multipolarity in Africa, is as big as it gets. Because these guys, the military guys in Niger, they are allied with the military guys in Mali. And of course, this means closer interaction with Wagner. And guess who was on the sidelines in the backstage of in St. Petersburg of Russia? Africa? Rigozin.
Yes, I
Shaking
saw.
hands.
Yes, I saw him.
So this story is so fantastic. I can see the fits of apoplexy all across the Beltway just looking at the pictures of all that. So this gives you a sketch of what went on these past 2 days in St. Petersburg. It is, yes, it's as big as it gets, really.
Well, it's always so interesting to just scan the Western mainstream media and see the condemnations of the coup in Niger with absolutely no irony there, given
No
all of the
irony.
coups that they explicitly support, including the one in Ukraine from 2014. But I wanted to ask you if you could explain, given how Putin and Russia, first of all, Russia and China being at the center of all of this activity that you just mentioned, but perhaps you can center the discussion a bit on this international north-south trade corridor, which Putin did raise during the Russia-Africa summit as a huge and potential linkage that could replace this Suez Canal, the dominance of the Suez Canal in trade, not just in the region, but of course, a large percentage of trade in general from that part of the world to the rest of the world happens and goes through that important link that has been mainly Western dominated for much of its
Exactly.
history. Could you talk
Oh
about
yeah.
this new North-South trade corridor? And you mentioned it in the article about BRICS, so it might be good to explain more about why
Yes.
this is so
Look,
important.
yeah, Danny, I have been writing about the INSTC for months now, and in fact, I was probably the first Westerner to write about it years ago when it was still developing, and it picked up speed after the start of the special military operation, and especially picked up speed this year after the Russians decided to invest at least $2 billion, maybe more, to finish an essential railway in Iran that is absolutely essential to connect Russia, Iran, the Caspian, and then all the way to India. The three main partners of the INSTC are Russia, Iran, and India. So, okay, hypothetically, let's think of a bunch of Russian merchandise leaving St. Petersburg or Moscow, then traveling by road or railway to Astrakhan, the Russian port in the Caspian. Then they cross the Caspian by ship. They can go anywhere. They can go to Azerbaijan, for instance, then Caucasus, and then even to Europe via Turkey, for instance. But mostly they will cross the Caspian south to Iran. It's a multimodal, as they call it, trade corridor. And then once again, railway or road all the way to southern Iran, to the part of Iran that borders the Gulf of Oman, near the Persian Gulf. And then by ship all the way to the Arabian Sea, and then the Indian Ocean to India. So we can have Moscow and St. Petersburg, Astrakhan, the port of Bandar Abbas in southern Iran, or the port of Chabahar, for instance, and Mumbai in India as the main nodes, back and forth, multimodal, roadways, railways, sea navigation. The Caspian is an inland sea, of course, and sea travel. This will bypass the Suez Canal in terms of time of travel and costs. It's absolutely essential for everyone involved and everyone around it as well. For the Indians, it's a matter of national security because this is the Indian way, which is something that they had been discussing and investing somewhat on and off for years. How can we have our Indian Silk Road? The best solution that they found was Mumbai, Chabahar in Iran, and then Chabahar via road and railway to Afghanistan and then Central Asia. So this will be the Indian Silk Road from India across the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, via Iran. The relations between India and Iran are very, very close, historically as well. And then through Afghanistan, considering that Afghanistan now is free of US occupation, and then all the way to Central Asia, the Central Asian neighbors of Afghanistan. The problem is the Indians, once again, the Indians is a very complicated story. They invest and the money stops, and then they try to find more money for investment and they can find it, and then they change their mind, and then they get under pressure by the US, and then they start thinking about AUKUS and the Quad, and then they say, no, maybe this is not a good idea, maybe we have to think about our Silk Road again. And meanwhile, what the Chinese do, they keep investing and doing business all the time, including the possibility that they would take over the port of Chabahar because the Indians were not investing enough or investing what they promised. So now the Indians finally woke up and said, no, let's invest in the international north-south transportation corridor, because this opens for us not only the Chabahar way as our Silk Road through Afghanistan all the way to Central Asia, but it opens ourselves to more business with Iran and with Russia, bypassing the Suez Canal. So now the Indians are finally trying to get their act together. You never know with them, of course. It's always a very complicated issue. And so when I discuss this with some of my retired Indian diplomat friends, most of them are realpolitik practitioners, they despair as well. Indians also despair in terms of the process of making decisions at the top of the Modi government and all that. It's extremely complicated, but at least they're trying to get their act together. So there was today in St. Petersburg one panel fully dedicated to the international north-south transportation corridor, which is going to become an enormous alternative to the Suez Canal, and that explains, among other reasons, why nobody in mainstream Western media talks about the INSTC. They don't even know what it is, in fact. You won't see that in the Washington Post, Le Monde, etc. They don't know what it is, and they don't even know how to address it. They only know it's a threat, and it's another Russian-Iranian invention. So it's malign by definition. So this the evolution of the INSTC will be in parallel to the evolution of the Belt and Road Initiative. Parallel, not always intersecting, but sometimes intersecting in the case of Iran. Iran now, they have I would say, golden, platinum, rare earth opportunity of increasing their business simultaneously with Russia, China, and Iran, the three BRICS. This is extremely important from an Iranian point of view. And also the fact that Iran now is part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where the three BRICS are already there. And Iran is going to be inevitably part of BRICS Plus, because the three BRICS are totally in favor of admitting Iran as a full-time BRICS member. So this, in a nutshell, for all of you, is how important the international north-south transportation corridor really is in terms of an extra alternative in terms of trade corridors and connectivity corridors, and uniting three absolutely major players in Eurasian integration. Two BRICS, Russia and India, and Iran.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.